The war ended. The paperwork did not. That is the first thing you need to understand before anything else in this narration makes sense. When people talk about the Second World War, they talk about it in a language that was invented after the fact, a language of liberation and sacrifice and the long arc of justice bending towards something better. They talk about it as though the outcome was the point, as though victory was a verdict, as though the side that won had won something clean. That framing has been so thoroughly embedded into the culture of every nation that participated that questioning it feels almost obscene. But the framing is wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the Allies should not have fought. Not wrong in the sense that Nazi Germany was not a genuine catastrophe for the human species. But wrong in the sense that it obscures nearly everything that actually happened. The war was not a story with a moral. It was a system with outputs. And the outputs, on every side, in every theater, across every year of the conflict, included things that the victory narrative has never been able to fully absorb. This narration is not going to tell you that both sides were equally bad. That is not the argument. The argument is more uncomfortable than that. The argument is that the war was fought by human beings operating inside institutions, and that institutions, regardless of the ideology that creates them, tend to produce the same behaviors when placed under the same pressures. The behaviors include dehumanization. They include the routinization of violence. They include paperwork. They include chain of command. They include the gradual erosion of individual moral judgment until the question is no longer whether to do a thing, but only how efficiently to do it. That process happened inside the Wehrmacht. It happened inside the Red Army. It happened inside the United States military. It happened inside the British colonial apparatus. It happened inside the Japanese imperial system. The scale and the direction varied enormously. The process itself did not. What follows is an account of 18 realities from the Second World War that have been consistently minimized, misrepresented, or simply left out of the standard telling. None of them are secret in the sense that historians do not know about them. All of them are documented. Most of them are accessible to anyone willing to read the primary sources. What makes them feel forbidden is not that they are hidden, but that they are inconvenient. They sit outside the frame that the war's outcome requires. They do not fit into a story where victory means something was resolved. There were approximately 70 to 85 million people killed during the Second World War. The range exists because counting bodies at that scale is itself a bureaucratic problem, and because some of the killing happened in ways that left no records, and because some of the records that existed were deliberately destroyed, and because some of the records that survived were sealed for decades by governments that needed their populations to believe in the cleanliness of what had been done in their name. The number itself has become so large that it functions as an abstraction. It is processed as a statistic rather than as 70 to 85 million individual terminations of human experience. That abstraction was not accidental. It was produced by the same institutional logic that produced the killing. When you are managing violence at industrial scale, you need accounting systems. You need categories. You need the ability to process information about mass death without the information processing system breaking down. The Nazis were extraordinarily efficient at this. So were the Soviets. So, in different ways, were the Americans and the British. The first reality that changes the meaning of victory is this. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany was not primarily a military operation. It was a terror campaign directed at civilian populations, and it was understood to be exactly that by the people who designed and executed it. This is not a revisionist interpretation. It is documented in the internal memoranda of the British Air Ministry, in the strategic planning documents of the Royal Air Force, and in the post-war testimony of the men who ran it. Arthur Harris, who commanded RAF Bomber Command from 1942 onward, was explicit about the purpose of area bombing. The goal was not to destroy specific military targets. The goal was to break the morale of the German civilian population by destroying their homes, their cities, and their sense of physical safety. Harris believed, based on his reading of the available evidence, that if you killed enough German civilians and destroyed enough German housing, the German people would eventually refuse to continue fighting. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. The bombing intensified German civilian resolve in much the same way that the Blitz had intensified British civilian resolve. But the campaign continued regardless, because the infrastructure had been built, the crews had been trained, the aircraft had been manufactured, and the institutional logic of a bombing campaign that had been started could not easily be reversed. Between 1942 and 1945, British and American bombers killed somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians. The range reflects genuine uncertainty in the historical record. The city of Hamburg was struck in July and August of 1943 in a series of raids that created a firestorm, a self-sustaining column of superheated air that reached temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius and produced winds of 240 kilometers per hour at ground level. The firestorm moved through residential neighborhoods. It consumed approximately 35,000 people. Those people were not soldiers. They were not factory workers. They were not members of the Nazi Party in any meaningful sense. They were the civilian population of a large German city, and they burned because the campaign planners had determined that burning them served a strategic purpose. The planning documents describe this in the language of operations research: bomb loads, target coordinates, expected casualty rates, projected effects on industrial output. The language is precise and clean and entirely disconnected from the physical reality of what 35,000 people burning in a residential district actually looks like or sounds like or smells like. Dresden was bombed in February 1945. The war in Europe was effectively over. Germany was losing on both fronts. The Wehrmacht was in collapse, and the strategic rationale for continued area bombing of German cities had largely dissolved. Dresden was bombed anyway. The city had minimal military significance. It was known primarily as a cultural center, a Baroque city that had largely been spared earlier in the war. The raids killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people. The number was disputed for decades, with some estimates running far higher, and the historical argument about the exact figure has occasionally obscured the more fundamental question of why it happened at all. The answer, to the extent that there is one, is institutional momentum. The bombing campaign had been running for years. The aircraft were available. The crews were trained. The targets had been identified. The paperwork had been completed. The raids happened because the system that produced raids was still operating. This is not a statement that the Allied bombing campaign was equivalent to the Holocaust. It was not. The Holocaust was a deliberate, ideologically motivated program of genocide. The bombing campaign was a strategic decision that accepted mass civilian casualties as an acceptable cost of military operations. The distinction matters, but it matters less than the standard narrative suggests, because the standard narrative tends to treat the Allied bombing campaign as an unfortunate but unavoidable aspect of fighting a genocidal enemy, and the documentary record does not support that framing. The campaign was not a reluctant necessity. It was a chosen strategy, implemented with institutional thoroughness, and it killed hundreds of thousands of people who were not combatants. The second reality is the conduct of the Soviet Union during and after the war, and specifically the behavior of the Red Army during its advance into Germany. This is a subject that was systematically suppressed during the Cold War, partly because the Soviet Union was an ally, partly because the scale of what happened was genuinely difficult to integrate into the liberation narrative, and partly because the victims were Germans, which made their victimhood politically complicated. What happened was this. As the Red Army moved through Eastern Germany in 1944 and 1945, Soviet soldiers engaged in mass rape on a scale that had no precedent in the documented history of the European theater. The estimates, which are necessarily imprecise because the Soviet government suppressed documentation and because victims were often unable or unwilling to report, range from 1 million to 2 million German women raped during the Soviet advance. Those numbers come from post-war German medical records, from testimony collected by historians in the decades after the war, and from internal Soviet military documents that became partially accessible after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The rapes were not isolated incidents. They were systematic. They occurred across the entire Eastern Front. They continued after the German surrender through the occupation period. Soviet military commanders were aware of what was happening. Some issued orders prohibiting the behavior. The orders had essentially no effect. The behavior continued because it was tolerated at the institutional level, because it was understood as a form of reward for soldiers who had suffered enormous casualties fighting eastward across the most brutal theater of the war, and because the victims were Germans, which in the operational logic of the Red Army in 1945 meant that they occupied a moral category that did not require protection. The women who were raped ranged in age from children to elderly women. There is documentation of women in their 80s being assaulted. The documentation exists not because Soviet officials created it, but because post-war German medical and social welfare records contain it. Ilya Ehrenberg, a Soviet propagandist whose work was widely distributed to Red Army soldiers, had written material that explicitly encouraged the dehumanization of German civilians. His pamphlets described Germans not as soldiers or combatants, but as a category of being that required extermination. Ehrenberg's influence on Red Army behavior during the advance into Germany has been debated by historians, with some arguing that his propaganda directly contributed to atrocities, and others arguing that the violence would have occurred regardless of what any propagandist wrote. What is not debated is that his material was distributed, that it encouraged the treatment of German civilians as subhuman targets, and that Soviet military command permitted this material to circulate among soldiers who were about to enter German territory. The third reality is the treatment of prisoners of war by Japan, which has been documented extensively, but which the standard narrative tends to treat as an aberration rather than as a policy. The Bataan Death March is the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners of war resulted in a death rate of approximately 27%, compared to a death rate of approximately 4% for Allied prisoners held by Germany. The difference reflects not primarily a difference in resource availability, but a difference in institutional policy. The Japanese military operated under a code, derived from a particular interpretation of the Bushido tradition, that defined surrender as a form of moral failure. A soldier who surrendered was not a prisoner of war, in the sense that the Geneva Conventions defined that term. A soldier who surrendered was something closer to a moral category of non-person, someone who had forfeited the right to consideration through the act of capitulation. This framework produced a system in which Allied prisoners were routinely beaten, starved, worked to death, subjected to medical experimentation, and executed for infractions that would have resulted in minor discipline in any Western military context. The Thailand-Burma Railway, constructed between 1942 and 1943, using Allied prisoner of war labor alongside Asian forced laborers, killed approximately 12,000 Allied prisoners and somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 Asian workers, most of them from Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The Asian workers have largely been absent from the standard narrative, which tends to focus on the Allied prisoners because the Allied prisoners left more documentation and because their deaths fit more neatly into the war narrative. The Asian workers were recruited, often through coercion, with false promises of wages and conditions that did not materialize. They were worked under essentially the same conditions as the prisoners of war, with even less access to medical care, and they died at even higher rates. Their deaths were not recorded with the same systematic attention that the Japanese military gave to the deaths of Allied prisoners, because the institutional framework that governed the railway's construction did not include a category for their welfare. The fourth reality is what happened at Nanking in December 1937, which was not technically part of the Second World War, as it is conventionally defined, but which was part of the broader conflict that the war grew out of, and which established the institutional and behavioral patterns that the Japanese military would carry into the Pacific War. The Nanking Massacre, sometimes called the Rape of Nanking, involved the killing of somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over a period of approximately 6 weeks following the Japanese capture of the city. The range in the estimates reflects genuine historiographical dispute, with Japanese nationalist historians tending toward the lower end and Chinese sources tending toward the higher end. But no serious historical account places the number below 100,000. And the documentary evidence, including photographs, testimony from Western diplomats and businessmen who were present in the city during the killings, and surviving Japanese military records, establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that what occurred was a systematic campaign of mass murder, rape, and torture directed at the civilian population of a major city. What the Nanking documentation shows is not primarily individual soldiers committing atrocities in the heat of battle. It shows a structured process. Officers organized competitions among their men for the most efficient killing. Prisoners were executed in organized groups. The behavior was systematic enough to leave administrative records. There were orders, counter-orders, reports, and documentation flowing through the Japanese military chain of command while the killing was happening. Some Japanese officers objected to what was occurring and attempted to restrain it. Their objections were largely ineffective because the institutional framework at the top of the Japanese military command did not support restraint. The killing continued not because it was chaotic, but because it was permitted. The fifth reality is Unit 731, which was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated in occupied Manchuria from 1937 until 1945. Unit 731 conducted experiments on human beings, primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but also Soviet, Korean, and Allied prisoners. The experiments included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases. They included vivisection without anesthesia. They included pressure experiments designed to determine the effects of rapid decompression on human physiology. They included frostbite experiments in which subjects were immersed in cold water or exposed to sub-zero temperatures until their limbs froze, then subjected to various warming procedures to assess the viability of the tissue. They included tests of incendiary weapons on human subjects. The unit operated for approximately 8 years and is estimated to have killed somewhere between 3,000 and 12,000 people through direct experimentation. The range reflects the incomplete state of the records, many of which were destroyed by Japanese military personnel at the end of the war. What makes Unit 731 particularly relevant to the question of what victory means is what happened after the war. The scientists and military officers who ran Unit 731 were not prosecuted at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. They were not tried, imprisoned, or in most cases publicly identified. The United States government, which controlled the occupation of Japan, made a decision to grant immunity to the personnel of Unit 731 in exchange for the research data that had been gathered through the experiments. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters negotiated this arrangement with the Japanese military scientists. The reasoning was that the data on biological warfare agents and their effects on human populations was valuable to American military planning in the context of the early Cold War, and that the cost of prosecution, which might have resulted in the data being destroyed or denied, was higher than the cost of allowing the perpetrators to go free. The scientists involved in Unit 731 subsequently went on to have careers in Japanese medicine, academia, and industry. Some of them became prominent figures in post-war Japanese public life. The institutional arrangement that allowed this was classified for decades. The first substantial public documentation in the United States came through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s. The sixth reality is the internment of Japanese Americans during the war, which is not a secret and which has been formally acknowledged by the United States government, but which the standard narrative tends to treat as an aberration, a regrettable mistake made under the pressure of wartime fear, rather than as a reflection of institutional racism operating through legal and administrative channels. 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, approximately two-thirds of whom were American citizens, were forcibly relocated from their homes on the West Coast and confined in detention camps from 1942 until 1945. They were not charged with any crime. They were not given hearings. They were not provided with legal representation. They were categorized, processed, and moved through a bureaucratic system that had been assembled with considerable speed and efficiency in the months following Pearl Harbor. The internal documentation of the War Relocation Authority, the agency created to manage the internment, describes the process in administrative language: population movements, relocation centers, resident management. The language obscures what was actually occurring, which was the forcible removal of American citizens from their homes based entirely on their ethnic background, with no individual assessment of loyalty, risk, or any other factor. The process was endorsed by President Roosevelt, implemented by the War Department, upheld by the Supreme Court in Korematsu vs. United States, and administered by thousands of government employees who filed the necessary forms and issued the necessary orders and transported the necessary people to the necessary locations without, in most cases, any apparent sense that they were participating in something that would later require formal apology. The Japanese American families who were interned lost their homes, their businesses, their savings, and in some cases years of their lives. They were compensated decades later with a payment of $20,000 per surviving internee, a figure that the original legislation sponsors acknowledged was inadequate. The seventh reality is the conduct of the war in the Pacific, particularly the island hopping campaign and the treatment of Japanese prisoners by American forces. The Pacific War was characterized by a level of racial dehumanization on both sides that exceeded anything in the European theater, and this dehumanization was documented, photographed, and in some cases officially sanctioned. American servicemen routinely collected body parts of Japanese soldiers as trophies. Teeth, ears, and skulls were taken from Japanese dead, and sometimes from Japanese wounded who were killed specifically for that purpose. This behavior was documented by military authorities, reported by journalists, and in at least one case celebrated in the American press. Life magazine published a photograph in 1944 of an American woman looking at a Japanese skull that had been sent to her as a gift by her boyfriend, a sailor in the Pacific. The photograph generated some criticism, but not the kind of institutional response that comparable behavior on the part of German soldiers with American remains would have generated, because the framework of racial difference that governed American perception of the Pacific War made Japanese bodies a different category of object than American or European bodies. The institutional dehumanization of Japanese soldiers and civilians was documented in military training materials, in recruiting posters, and in the language used by military commanders in official communications. Admiral William Halsey, who commanded American naval forces in the South Pacific, made statements about Japanese people that used explicitly racial and subhuman language, and these statements were reported approvingly in the American press. The framing of the Pacific War as a conflict against a fundamentally alien and inferior racial group shaped American military decision-making in ways that extended beyond individual acts of brutality. It contributed to the decision to use incendiary bombing against Japanese cities beginning in March 1945, which resulted in the death of approximately 100,000 civilians in Tokyo in a single night. And it contributed to the context in which the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were understood and accepted. The eighth reality is the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, which killed more people in a single military operation than either atomic bombing, and which has been almost entirely displaced from popular memory by the atomic bombings that came 5 months later. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the B-29 bombing campaign against Japan, made a decision in early 1945 to switch from high-altitude precision bombing of industrial targets to low-altitude incendiary bombing of residential areas. The reasoning was that Japanese industry was dispersed through residential neighborhoods, that high-altitude precision bombing was technically unreliable, and that incendiary weapons would be more effective against the predominantly wooden construction of Japanese cities. The reasoning was operationally sound in its own terms. The result was the single most destructive air raid in human history. On the night of March 9th, 334 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 1,500 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo's residential districts. The bombing created a firestorm that spread across approximately 16 square miles of the city. The death toll is estimated at between 80,000 and 100,000 people, though some Japanese sources place it higher. Approximately 1 million people were left homeless. The attack destroyed approximately 270,000 buildings. LeMay described the decision in his memoirs with the matter-of-fact language of an operations commander. The numbers were good. The targeting was effective. The campaign achieved its objectives. The objectives included killing Japanese civilians in sufficient numbers to make continued Japanese resistance untenable. The incendiary campaign continued through the spring and summer of 1945. By the time of the atomic bombings in August, the B-29 campaign had already destroyed 67 Japanese cities and killed several 100,000 civilians. The atomic bombs were, in the context of the campaign that preceded them, not a qualitative change in the nature of the violence being done to Japanese civilians, but a quantitative increase in the efficiency with which that violence could be delivered. 2 bombs replaced the need for hundreds of aircraft and thousands of tons of conventional ordnance. The effect on the ground was different in character because of radiation and the specific physics of nuclear detonation, but the institutional logic that produced the atomic bombings was the same institutional logic that had produced the firebombing campaign. The 9th reality is the behavior of French forces, and particularly the Moroccan Goumier attached to the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy during the Italian campaign of 1944. Following the Allied breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944, French colonial troops operating in the area south of Rome engaged in a campaign of rape and violence against Italian civilians that was documented by Italian civil authorities, acknowledged by French military command, and then largely suppressed from both French and Allied historical accounts. The estimates of Italian civilians raped range from several thousand to tens of thousands, with the Italian government establishing a compensation fund for victims in 1952 that paid out claims for approximately 7,000 victims. The actual number of rapes was certainly higher than the number of claims because many victims did not come forward, and because the social and institutional barriers to reporting rape in rural Italy in 1944 were substantial. The French military command was aware of what was occurring. There were orders issued prohibiting rape and the killing of civilians. The orders were largely ineffective. Some soldiers were prosecuted after the fact. The prosecutions were not systematic, and the sentences imposed were generally not commensurate with the scale of what had occurred. The behavior was understood within the French military as a consequence of using colonial troops who operated under different disciplinary frameworks and different cultural assumptions about the treatment of enemy civilians. That framing was self-serving and obscured the fact that the behavior continued because French military command tolerated it, and because the institutional structure of the French Expeditionary Corps in 1944 did not include mechanisms capable of enforcing prohibitions against violence against civilians at the scale required. The 10th reality is the Dresden bombing, already mentioned, but viewed through a different lens. The question of how it was decided, who knew about it, and why the decision was made when it was made. By February 1945, the strategic rationale for area bombing of German cities was essentially exhausted. Germany was losing the war. The Wehrmacht was retreating on both fronts. The German industrial base had been severely damaged by bombing and by the loss of occupied territories. The targeting of Dresden was justified at the time, partly on the grounds that it was a railway hub, and that its destruction would disrupt German supply lines to the Eastern Front, thereby supporting the Soviet advance. This justification was questionable at the time and has not held up well under subsequent historical examination. The railway infrastructure at Dresden was not the primary target of the raids. The residential areas of the city were the primary target, because the campaign planners were still applying the area bombing doctrine that had been developed to break civilian morale, even in a context where the war's outcome was no longer in serious doubt. The decision to bomb Dresden involved coordination between British and American air commands and was made at a level of the Allied command structure that included awareness of the war's trajectory. The people who made the decision knew that Germany was losing. They knew that the war was approaching its end. They proceeded because the institutional apparatus of the bombing campaign was operational, because the request for the raid had come through appropriate channels, and because within the framework of the campaign's operational logic, Dresden was a legitimate target. The logic was consistent. The outcome was the destruction of a city that had largely been spared throughout the war and the death of 22,000 to 25,000 people in the final months of a war that was already functionally over. The 11th reality is the Morgenthau Plan, which was a proposal developed in 1944 by Henry Morgenthau Jr., the United States Secretary of the Treasury, for the post-war treatment of Germany. The plan proposed to strip Germany of all industrial capacity, to divide the country, and to convert it into a predominantly agricultural nation. The explicit goal was to ensure that Germany could never again develop the industrial base required to wage industrial-scale war. The plan was approved in principle by both Roosevelt and Churchill at the Quebec Conference in September 1944. It was subsequently leaked to the press, generated significant controversy, and was eventually abandoned as a formal policy document. But the framework of thinking about post-war Germany that the Morgenthau Plan represented continued to influence American occupation policy for the first 2 years after the war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive, JCS 1067, which governed American occupation policy in Germany from 1945 to 1947, embodied elements of the Morgenthau approach. It prohibited American occupation authorities from taking steps to rebuild the German economy or to improve the standard of living of the German population above a subsistence level. The result was that in the first 2 years after the war, the German civilian population experienced conditions that were in some respects worse than wartime conditions. Food production collapsed. Industrial output fell to a fraction of pre-war levels. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was extraordinarily harsh, and the combination of cold and food shortage resulted in significant civilian mortality among a population that had just survived 6 years of war. The German civilians who died of cold and starvation in 1946 and 1947 were not the subject of war crimes trials. Their deaths were not categorized as the result of Allied policy decisions. They were understood as the consequence of the war itself, the natural result of Germany's defeat, even though the occupation policies that contributed to their deaths had been deliberately chosen. The 12th reality is Operation Keelhaul, which was the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens from Western-controlled areas to the Soviet Union following the German surrender. The Yalta Agreement between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin included a provision requiring the Western Allies to repatriate Soviet citizens who had ended up in Western-controlled territory, regardless of whether those individuals wished to return. The category of Soviet citizens who were subject to repatriation included former Red Army soldiers who had been captured by Germany and had survived German prisoner of war camps, Cossack communities that had collaborated with Germany after being offered protection by the Wehrmacht, civilians who had ended up in Western Europe through the displacement of war, and in some cases people who had emigrated from Russia before the Soviet period, but who were categorized as Soviet citizens for purposes of the agreement. The repatriation was not voluntary. Soviet citizens who refused to return were forcibly removed by British and American forces and handed over to Soviet military representatives. In the immediate post-war period, the Soviet Union's treatment of returning prisoners of war and suspected collaborators was not a secret. It was known that the Soviet government categorized soldiers who'd been captured by Germany as potential traitors, regardless of the circumstances of their capture, and that many of them would face imprisonment, labor camp sentences, or execution on return. British and American military commanders who were involved in implementing the repatriation understood this. The orders were implemented regardless. The scale of Operation Keelhaul was substantial. Estimates of the number of people forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union by Western forces range from roughly 1 million to upwards of 2 million. The process involved scenes of considerable violence, with British soldiers beating and in some cases killing Soviet citizens who resisted deportation at camps in Austria and Germany. The operation continued into 1946 and in some cases into 1947. The British government classified documents related to the operation for decades. When the operation became more widely known in the West, partly through the publication of Nikolai Tolstoy's book on the subject in 1977, it generated significant controversy, but it was never the subject of formal accountability processes equivalent to those applied to German war crimes. The 13th reality is the behavior of the American military in the Philippines, and specifically the conduct of operations in the final stages of the Pacific War in contexts that the standard narrative tends to treat as straightforward liberation campaigns. When American forces returned to the Philippines in 1944 and 1945, the military campaign to retake the islands resulted in civilian casualties on a substantial scale. The liberation of Manila in February and March 1945 involved intense urban combat, in which American forces used artillery and air support in populated residential areas, contributing to the deaths of approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians. The Filipino civilian deaths in Manila have been documented by Filipino historians, but are largely absent from American accounts of the liberation campaign, which focus on the military aspects of the battle and on the atrocities committed by Japanese forces against Filipino civilians. The atrocities committed by Japanese forces in Manila during the final weeks of the battle were genuine and horrific. Japanese naval and army units conducted massacres of Filipino civilians and committed mass rape as American forces closed in on the city. Those atrocities are documented and real. The civilian casualties caused by American artillery and air support in residential areas are also documented and real. The standard narrative makes the first category of events central and treats the second category as an unfortunate military necessity. The distinction rests on intention rather than outcome, and while intention matters morally, it does not change the physical reality of what happened to the Filipino civilians caught between the two militaries. The 14th reality is the economics of the war, and specifically the use of forced labor by both the Nazi state and its corporate allies. The use of forced labor in German industry is well documented. Approximately 12 million foreign workers, including prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and civilians forcibly transported from occupied territories, worked in German industry during the war. The companies that used this labor included German industrial firms that continued to operate after the war, and that were, in many cases, never held fully accountable for the labor conditions they had imposed. E.g. Farben, the chemical conglomerate that manufactured the Zyklon B used in the gas chambers, and that operated a synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz using concentration camp labor, was dissolved after the war, and its assets were divided among successor companies. Several executives were convicted at the Nuremberg trials, but the sentences were generally light, and most of those convicted were released within a few years. The successor companies continued operating. Some of them became significant components of the post-war West German economic miracle. The use of forced labor was not limited to Germany. The Soviet Union's Gulag system used prisoner labor extensively throughout the war and in the post-war period. Japan used forced labor from occupied territories across the Pacific. The United States used the labor of interned Japanese Americans in some contexts. The scale and conditions varied enormously between these systems, and the Nazi use of concentration camp labor was unique in the extent to which labor and extermination were combined in the same institutional framework. But the principle of using coerced human beings as productive economic inputs was not unique to any single party in the war. The 15th reality is the liberation of the concentration camps and what happened in the immediate aftermath, which was not the story of clean rescue that the standard narrative implies. When American and British forces entered the camps in April and May 1945, they found conditions of extraordinary degradation, bodies stacked in piles, survivors too weak to stand, typhus and dysentery moving through populations that had been starved for months or years. The liberating forces were not prepared for what they found. They had been told that there were camps. They had not been told, or had not fully processed, what the camps actually were. The photographs that were taken in the first days of liberation, photographs that have become among the most reproduced images in the historical record of the 20th century, capture a moment of institutional encounter with the product of an industrial process of killing. The soldiers in the photographs look at the surviving inmates and at the bodies and at the infrastructure of the camps with expressions that are difficult to categorize. They are not the expressions of men who knew what they were going to find. The immediate aftermath was characterized by significant mortality among the survivors. The camps had been places of starvation, and the liberating forces initially provided food in the form of military rations, rich food that the digestive systems of the survivors, after years of near starvation, could not process. Many survivors died in the weeks immediately following liberation from refeeding syndrome, a physiological response to the rapid restoration of caloric intake after prolonged starvation. The military medical infrastructure available to deal with the scale of what the camps contained was inadequate. The Allied command structures had not planned for the logistics of managing hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors, because planning for that would have required a prior acknowledgement of what the camps were and what they contained, and that acknowledgement had been deferred throughout the war. The displaced persons who survived the camps and emerged into a Germany that had just been conquered faced years of uncertainty. The British and American occupation zones established displaced persons camps to house concentration camp survivors and other displaced people, and these camps, in some cases, maintained conditions that were significantly better than the concentration camps, but were still characterized by inadequate food, inadequate medical care, and a bureaucratic processing system that moved slowly and produced outcomes that were often indeterminate. Jewish survivors who wished to emigrate to Palestine faced British immigration restrictions that remained in effect even after the scale of what had happened to European Jews had been fully documented. The bureaucratic mechanisms that governed immigration to Palestine were functioning normally in the summer and fall of 1945, processing applications and issuing denials by the thousands, in a context where the people whose applications were being denied had survived the attempted extermination of their people. The 16th reality is the Nuremberg trials themselves, which are typically presented as the founding moment of international criminal law, the point at which humanity decided that individuals who commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity could be held accountable before an international tribunal. This is a genuine and significant historical development. The trials were also characterized by significant problems that have been acknowledged by legal historians, but that tend to be minimized in the popular account. The most significant problem was the principle of tu quoque, which in legal terms means the argument that a defendant cannot be found guilty of an act that the prosecuting party has also committed. The Nuremberg Tribunal rejected tu quoque as a defense, ruling that the illegality of an action is not affected by the fact that other parties have also committed the same action. This was a legally coherent ruling. It was also a ruling that allowed the tribunal to proceed without addressing the bombing campaign against German civilians, the Soviet treatment of German prisoners, the repatriation policies, and a range of other Allied actions that fell within the categories of war crimes or crimes against humanity as those categories were defined by the tribunal's charter. The selective application of the tribunal's principles was not secret. German defense attorneys raised it. The prosecutors responded that the jurisdiction of the tribunal extended only to acts committed by the defendants, not to acts committed by the Allied powers. This was legally consistent with the terms of the tribunal's charter. It was not morally consistent with the claim that the tribunal was establishing universal principles of individual criminal accountability for actions committed in the context of war and state authority. The trials produced a framework of international criminal law that has been enormously influential in subsequent decades. They also produced a framework that was designed and implemented by the victorious powers and that was applied exclusively to the defeated powers. That is not a criticism that invalidates the legal outcomes of the trials. It is an observation about the conditions under which those outcomes were produced. The 17th reality is the fate of the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, and the decision made by American occupation authorities to protect him from war crimes prosecution. Hirohito had been the head of state of the Japanese Empire throughout the war. The question of his personal knowledge of and responsibility for Japanese war crimes, including the Nanking Massacre, the conduct of the prisoner of war system, and the activities of Unit 731, has been debated by historians for decades. The weight of the evidence suggests that Hirohito was aware of, and in some cases directly involved in military decisions that resulted in war crimes, though the extent of his personal direction of those activities remains disputed. General MacArthur, who commanded the American occupation of Japan, made a determination that prosecuting the emperor would make the occupation ungovernable. The Japanese population's relationship to the emperor was not simply one of political loyalty to a head of state, but was embedded in a religious and cultural framework that made Hirohito something closer to a divine figure than a political leader. MacArthur's calculation was that if the emperor was prosecuted, the Japanese population would resist American occupation in ways that would require a substantially larger military presence and might result in continued armed conflict. This calculation may have been correct. It was also a calculation that resulted in the person who sat at the apex of the Japanese state during the commission of war crimes on a massive scale being declared by American occupation authorities to be exempt from prosecution. Hirohito remained emperor until his death in 1989. He never publicly acknowledged personal responsibility for the war or for the atrocities committed in his name. Japanese veterans of Nanking, the prisoner of war camps, and Unit 731 died in most cases without being prosecuted. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal convicted and executed several Japanese military and political leaders, but the selection of defendants was shaped by the same political considerations that governed the decision to exempt the emperor. The 18th reality is what happened to the knowledge that the war produced. The Second World War generated an enormous amount of technical, scientific, and intelligence information, much of it produced through processes that would have been criminal under any legal framework that the war itself created. The Nazi regime's medical experiments produced data on hypothermia, on the effects of high-altitude exposure on human physiology, on the development of infectious diseases in controlled populations, on the effects of various poisons and pharmaceutical compounds on human subjects. Unit 731 produced data on biological warfare agents. The German rocket program, which used concentration camp labor and killed several thousand workers, produced the technical knowledge that formed the foundation of both American and Soviet space programs. Operation Paperclip was the American program, largely classified at the time, through which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States after the war to work for American military and scientific agencies. The program included individuals who had been members of the Nazi Party, individuals who had used concentration camp labor, and in at least some cases individuals who had direct involvement in war crimes. Werner von Braun, who became the central figure in the American space program, and a celebrated figure in American popular culture through the 1950s and 1960s, had been an SS officer and had overseen the use of concentration camp labor at the Mittelwerk facility where V-2 rockets were produced. The Mittelwerk used approximately 60,000 slave laborers drawn from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, of whom approximately 20,000 died. Von Braun's SS membership and his knowledge of conditions at the Mittelwerk were known to American authorities when he was brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. They were known, and the decision was made that his technical knowledge was more valuable than his accountability. He became a NASA director. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977, 2 years after his death. The medal was presented posthumously. The Soviet Union ran a parallel program, sometimes called Operation WWII, in which Soviet forces in occupied Germany removed German scientists and engineers to the Soviet Union, in some cases forcibly, and used their knowledge to accelerate Soviet military and space programs. The Germans brought to the Soviet Union under this program were not given the relatively comfortable conditions of their counterparts in the American program. They were housed in restricted facilities, denied contact with their families for extended periods, and eventually repatriated under circumstances that left them isolated from the West German scientific community that had grown up in their absence. The technical knowledge they had developed in Germany was used to build the Soviet ICBM program and the launch vehicle that put Sputnik in orbit. The knowledge extracted from the Nazi regime was not limited to rocketry. American and British intelligence agencies acquired German cryptographic, signals intelligence and operational intelligence files and personnel. The Gehlen organization, built by General Reinhard Gehlen, who had headed German military intelligence operations on the Eastern Front, was absorbed into the post-war American intelligence framework and eventually became the foundation of the West German intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. Gehlen's network included former SS officers and individuals with documented involvement in war crimes on the Eastern Front. The network was used by American intelligence throughout the early Cold War period, and its personnel files were classified for decades. The people who had gathered intelligence for the German military by methods that included the torture and execution of prisoners were now gathering intelligence for the American intelligence apparatus by methods that were less clearly documented. What the war produced in the end was not a resolution of the systems that had generated it. It produced a realignment of power, a set of legal frameworks that were applied selectively to the defeated, a geopolitical structure that divided the world between two successor states of the Allied coalition, and a vast transfer of institutional knowledge from the losing states to the winning states. The scientists who had worked for the Nazi regime were now working for the Americans or the Soviets. The intelligence networks were being rebuilt under new management. The corporations that had used forced labor were continuing to operate under new names or with their wartime activities classified or suppressed. The bureaucratic systems that had processed human beings into categories of acceptable loss were intact. They had learned to operate under different political frameworks. The displaced persons camps in Europe closed gradually over the following years as survivors found places to go. The last displaced persons camp in Germany closed in 1957, 12 years after the end of the war. The people who had survived the camps and the war and the occupation period dispersed to Israel, to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to South America, to whatever places would accept them. The countries they came from had been substantially destroyed. The communities they had been part of no longer existed. The languages some of them spoke were now spoken by no one else in the places where they tried to settle. The German officers who had administered the final solution were tried, convicted, and in some cases executed. Others were not tried. Some fled to South America with the assistance of networks that included elements of the Vatican and of intelligence services that found their knowledge useful. Adolf Eichmann, who had been one of the primary administrative architects of the deportation of European Jews to the death camps, escaped from American custody in 1946 and lived under a false name in Argentina until 1960, when he was captured by Israeli agents and brought to Israel for trial. His capture required a foreign intelligence operation in a sovereign country. His trial was conducted by a state that had not existed when the crimes he was tried for were committed. The legal framework that made his trial possible had been assembled after the crimes were finished. The war ended in formal terms on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The date is recorded, the document exists. The institutional frameworks that had produced the war, the military-industrial systems, the bureaucratic structures, the intelligence apparatus, the scientific programs, the legal doctrines that permitted civilian casualties in pursuit of military objectives, the racial and political categories that distributed who counted as a legitimate target and who did not. Those frameworks did not sign any instrument of surrender. They continued operating. They were reorganized, renamed, refined, and in some cases exported to new theaters of operation. The Cold War that began in the months immediately following the formal end of the Second World War used many of the same personnel, much of the same knowledge, and substantially the same institutional logic that the Second World War had produced. The records of what had been done were classified, sealed, destroyed, or stored in archives that would not be accessible to researchers for decades. The populations that had survived were given narratives about what had happened that emphasized the moral clarity of the outcome and minimized the processes by which the outcome had been achieved. The soldiers who had served were told, and in many cases genuinely believed, that they had participated in the liberation of the world from tyranny. Some of them had. Some of them had also participated in things that the liberation narrative could not accommodate, and the institutional processing of those experiences was designed to produce a memory that served the needs of the states that had emerged from the war, rather than a memory that accurately recorded what had occurred. The children of the survivors were taught in schools that used textbooks that had been written by the states that had won the war, states that had their own institutional reasons for the story to be told in particular ways. The children of the perpetrators were taught in schools that were administered by occupation authorities who had their own institutional reasons for particular kinds of forgetting. The children of the people who had been the objects of the various industrial processes of the war, whether those processes were the final solution, the Japanese prisoner of war system, the Soviet Gulag, the bombing campaigns, the forced labor programs, or the dozens of other mechanisms by which the war consumed human beings, grew up in communities that had been fundamentally altered by what had happened, in ways that the post-war narratives were not designed to capture. The war is now far enough in the past that the last participants are dying. The institutions that conducted it have been reorganized many times. The states that fought it have changed their governments, their constitutions, their alliances, and in some cases, their names and their borders. The technologies that the war produced have been superseded by technologies that make the industrial killing of the 1940s seem almost primitive. The legal frameworks that were established at Nuremberg have been expanded and elaborated, and in some cases applied, and in other cases ignored by the same states that created them, depending on whether application or non-application served their interests in a given situation. The question of what victory means in the context of the Second World War is not answerable in the terms that the victory narrative provides. The victory was real. The defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan prevented the consolidation of two genuinely catastrophic systems of power over large portions of the globe. That is not a trivial thing. But the victory was achieved by means that the victory narrative cannot fully account for, and it produced outcomes that the victory narrative cannot fully integrate, and it left intact the institutional machinery that had made the war possible in the first place. The machinery continued to operate. It still operates. The paperwork continues to be filed.